An extraordinary leader, an extraordinary woman. These are the words used by David Cameron to describe Margaret Thatcher. Now, in the studio today, we've got John Chapman. Now, John specialises in looking at historical figures as leaders. Now, John, can we have a look at Margaret Thatcher as a leader without the controversy? Can we take a dispassionate view of Margaret Thatcher as a leader?
Well, we can take a slightly more dispassionate view than some of the commentators are doing, but in reality, controversy is an essential part of her leadership style. She revelled in it, and to a degree, the media have conspired to produce a kind of a cartoon picture of this person, which is designed to fit a particular kind of pigeonhole. But we can step outside that and form a more balanced view.
She came across as a very charismatic, striking figure. Is this something that you'd say that singles out a leader?
Margaret Thatcher was extraordinary in terms of her charisma, and although it's not necessary for a leader to have the capacity to connect with large audiences and at a one-to-one level, it's possible to do both. Some leaders do manage both, and she was one of them. The thing about charisma is that it taps into very strong psychological archetypes that enable a leader to make connections with followers and with people at large. And what's interesting about Margaret Thatcher is look at the archetypes that she was connected with. So you have the Iron Lady, this sobriquet that was given to her by the Soviet press, which she lapped up and adopted as her own. You have that famous Gerald Scarfe cartoon of Boadicea. Again, this was an image which she revelled in, and it was very powerful, but of course it does feed into the whole area of controversy, because there were people who were strongly attracted to that charismatic image and people who were strongly repelled by it, and that's something which has continued through time.
She was called a conviction politician. Now, on the face of it, that sounds a good idea. You know where people are coming from. What's your take on that?
Well, of course, every leader needs to have a strong and conscious connection with the values that they're bringing into the leadership arena. That's absolutely essential, because when times get tough and under pressure, that's where we all tend to go as a reference point. So if you don't have a clear view about that, then you're going to get into trouble. Now, there is, of course, a downside to it, and it's a particular thing that happens, I think, with leaders right at the top, is that they tend to lose contact with the sense of perspective about what's going on. And of course, with Margaret Thatcher, you find that over time, she lost a lot of the advisors that she'd had around her whom she trusted, who actually could give her sort of a different perspective on what was going on. The tendency then is to surround yourself with people who think like you, and it creates a mentality which means that those convictions tend to increase, because I must be right, because everyone's telling me I'm right. And the capacity to empathise with people outside of that inner circle decreases. And over time, because that can lead to disaster. In the case of Margaret Thatcher, of course, most famously around the issue of the poll tax, that's exactly what happened.
So if we look in a historical context, she's been described as the greatest post-war leader that we've had. Can you put a wider perspective on that?
Well, I'm sure she would prefer to be compared against the great wartime leaders of the Conservative Party, like William Pitt the Younger in the Napoleonic Wars, for example, going right back to the early 19th century, or of course with Winston Churchill, the great war leader of the 20th century. But in terms of leading the country in a time of conflict, of course, the conflict that Margaret Thatcher is most associated with is the Falklands War, which was a relatively minor conflict and nothing like the kind of global conflicts that those other two prime ministers had to face. It might actually be more productive to compare her with some of the prime ministers who had to deal with political issues in a time where there's a lot of social conflict. So one might go back to Robert Peel and the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1830s and 40s, or with the Duke of Wellington introducing the one man, one vote in the 1830s. Now those were prime ministers who introduced structural changes which fundamentally altered the economy or the social fabric, the political fabric of the country. And I think that's probably where a more fruitful comparison lies.
So if we take these different perspectives that you've outlined here, how would we sum up Margaret Thatcher?
When we look at the criteria that we would apply to any leader in terms of whether they qualify to be called a high-performance leader, we look for a leader with a strong vision and clear and identifiable values, pursuing a worthy purpose. We look for someone who performs at an exceptional level in terms of the personal capacity in the job. We look at someone who manages to achieve that performance over an extended period of time and in a context where there is a huge amount of pressure. Now those are the kind of criteria which we would use to define a high-performance leader. And when one looks at those criteria, comparing them against Margaret Thatcher, you'd say that she pretty much ticks most of those boxes. But of course the fact that her reputation, her legacy is still so mired in controversy, even right at the end of her life, tells us something about where we might look for the questions in this, and that would be around the vision and values, because it's the role of any leader to take followers with you. And one of the things that, of course, we know about Margaret Thatcher is that she was essentially the product of a political system which is very partisan. So there are plenty of people who think she was wonderful and plenty of people who think she was terrible. And it seems like those two opinions are never really going to be reconciled.
Food for thought. Thank you very much, John.
You're welcome, Steve.